James was running late again, but today, it wasn't just his job on the line. It was everything. The crisp morning air carried the faint smell of coffee and exhaust fumes as he weaved through the busy downtown crowd. James wasn't the kind of man people noticed. At 45, he looked older than his years, his face lined with worry and his hair peppered with gray from the weight of responsibilities. He clutched his worn-out briefcase, a relic from better days, as if holding on to it would keep his world from crumbling further. As he rounded the corner, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his landlord. Another warning. The rent was overdue, and this time there were no extensions. James swallowed hard and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He was so distracted by his thoughts that he almost didn't notice the old man sitting by the curb, holding a small sign scrawled with shaky letters. Hungry. Anything helps. The man's sunken eyes met James's for just a moment, and James quickly looked away, guilt tightening in his chest. He couldn't even help himself. What could he possibly offer to someone else? But as fate would have it, their paths were about to cross in a way neither of them could have predicted. Just as James reached his office building, a commotion erupted nearby. A sleek black car, one that didn't belong in this modest part of town, was stalled in the middle of the road. Smoke curled from under its hood, and the driver, a sharp-suited man in his late 30s, was pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. His frustration was palpable, and the honking from impatient drivers only made matters worse. James glanced at his watch. He had 5 minutes to clock in. 5 minutes to save the job that was barely keeping his life afloat. But then he saw the old man again. He had stood up from his spot on the curb and was shuffling toward the stalled car, his frail body moving with a determination that caught James off guard. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, his voice weathered but steady. "I used to be a mechanic. Maybe I can help." The driver hesitated, his expression skeptical. But with no other options and no signal on his phone, he stepped aside. The old man bent over the engine, his hands moving with a precision that seemed out of place for someone who looked so fragile. James stood frozen, watching as the stranger worked. Minutes ticked by, but he couldn't pull himself away. And then, with a sputter, the engine roared to life. Relief washed over the driver's face, but what came next was completely unexpected. The man reached into his pocket and handed the old mechanic a business card. "Come see me tomorrow," he said. His tone wasn't a request. It was an order. The old man's eyes widened, his hand trembling as he took the card. James didn't know what was on that card, but he knew one thing for sure. This moment had just changed everything. James stood rooted to the spot, watching the old man clutch the business card like it was made of gold. The driver muttered a quick thank you before hopping back into his car, speeding off without another glance. The old man straightened slowly, his movements stiff and deliberate, and shuffled back toward the curb where his belongings sat in a small pile: a blanket, a tin can, and an old backpack. James found himself walking over, his curiosity outweighing his usual instinct to avoid interactions that might slow him down. "You fixed that car like it was nothing," James said, his voice breaking the silence between them. The old man looked up, his face worn but kind. "Just a trick I picked up in my younger days," the man replied, his voice steady but tired. "Used to work on engines for a living. Funny how life brings you full circle." James glanced at his watch again, anxiety tugging at him. He was officially late now, but something about this moment felt bigger than the ticking clock on his wrist. "What did that guy give you?" he asked, nodding toward the card still clutched in the man's weathered hand. The old man hesitated, as if the answer might change the fragile balance of his world. "Said I should come to his office tomorrow," he said finally, turning the card over in his fingers. "Seems a little too good to be true, don't you think?" James thought about the driver's tone, the way he had handed over the card like he was offering something rare. "Maybe," James said, his voice soft, "but what if it's not?" The old man chuckled, a sound filled with both warmth and disbelief. "Well, I suppose it doesn't hurt to find out. Name's Walter, by the way." James introduced himself, and for a moment the weight on his chest felt lighter. There was something grounding about Walter's calm demeanor, something that made James feel less alone in his own struggles. As the two exchanged a few more words, James's phone buzzed again. A notification from his boss this time, short, blunt, and clear. He was fired. The pit in James's stomach grew heavier, but he pushed the thought aside. "I hope it works out for you, Walter," he said, forcing a small smile. "I really do." As James turned to leave, Walter called out, "You know, son, sometimes the hardest moments bring the biggest opportunities. Don't let today get you down." James walked away, those words echoing in his mind, though they did little to dull the sting of what lay ahead for him. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about Walter's story was just beginning, and he had stumbled into it at the perfect moment. That night, James couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the scene at the curb, the way Walter had seemed almost destined to be there. Who was that man in the car? And why had he been so insistent about meeting Walter again? Questions tumbled over each other in James's mind as he stared at the ceiling of his tiny apartment. He had no job, no clear path forward, and yet he felt drawn to the mystery unfolding just a few blocks away. The next morning, James made a decision. He grabbed his coat, shoved his phone into his pocket, and headed back to the same curb where he had met Walter. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly, but something told him he needed to be there. And when he turned the corner and saw Walter standing there, freshly shaved and wearing a clean, if slightly oversized, shirt, he knew this story wasn't over. Walter was holding the card tightly, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Figured I'd see if you needed company," James said, walking up to him. Walter smiled faintly. "Well, I won't say no to that." As they started walking toward the address printed on the card, neither of them knew what they were stepping into. But both men could feel it. Something big was waiting on the other side. Walter and James walked side by side down the crowded city streets, their pace slow but purposeful. The address on the card was printed in bold, clear letters, an unmistakable sign of importance. Walter clutched it tightly, his knuckles pale against the frayed edges of the card. Every so often, James caught him glancing at it as though it might disappear if he didn't keep an eye on it. For James, the walk felt heavier with every step. He wasn't even sure why he was tagging along. Maybe it was the way Walter had spoken the day before, calm and measured, as though he had made peace with life's cruelest twists. Or maybe it was James's own desperation, a need to be part of something meaningful now that his own path seemed to have reached a dead end. Either way, he stayed close, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger with each step. The building they approached was unlike anything James had expected. It wasn't a glossy skyscraper or a corporate fortress. It was a modest brick structure tucked between two towering office complexes. The door was unmarked except for a small brass plaque that read, "Wilson Enterprises." James frowned, recognizing the name as unfamiliar. Walter hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally pushing it open. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air was cool and smelled faintly of leather and paper. The reception area was small but elegant, with polished wood furniture and soft lighting. A woman behind the desk looked up, her professional smile faltering briefly when she saw Walter. But instead of dismissing him, she stood up and walked around the desk. "You must be Mr. Walter," she said warmly, extending her hand. "Mr. Wilson is expecting you. Please, follow me." Walter's hand trembled slightly as he shook hers, then followed her down a hallway lined with framed photographs. James trailed behind, feeling out of place but too curious to turn back. He glanced at the photos, snapshots of workers in factories, mechanics bent over machines, engineers holding blueprints. Each face seemed to carry a story, but none of them offered any clues about what kind of place this was. The receptionist stopped in front of a large oak door and knocked twice before opening it. Inside was a spacious office, its walls lined with bookshelves and a single large window overlooking the city. Behind the desk sat a man who looked to be in his late 50s, his grey hair neatly combed and his expression calm but piercing. He rose to his feet as they entered. "Walter," the man said, stepping around the desk to greet him. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. My name is Henry Wilson." Walter nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's nice to meet you, sir." Henry's gaze shifted briefly to James, his eyes narrowing slightly as if assessing him. "And you are?" "James," he said quickly. "I'm just a friend." Henry gave a small nod, his expression unreadable, and gestured for them to sit. As they settled into the chairs across from him, Henry leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "Walter," he began, "the man you helped yesterday is a close friend of mine. He called me immediately after your encounter and told me about what you did. But what struck him most wasn't your skill as a mechanic. It was your integrity." Walter's brow furrowed, and he opened his mouth to respond, but Henry held up a hand to stop him. "I know you've been through a lot. I've read about your background, your struggles, and I believe you're exactly the kind of person I've been looking for." James's curiosity burned brighter now. What was this man talking about? And why did he seem so certain that Walter was the answer to something important? Henry continued, his tone steady but intense. "I run a foundation dedicated to giving second chances to people who've been overlooked by society. Veterans, skilled workers who've fallen on hard times, people with potential who just need the right opportunity. And I think you could be more than just a beneficiary of this program. I think you could help us lead it." Walter's eyes widened, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "Me?" he stammered. "I'm just an old mechanic. What could I possibly offer?" Henry smiled faintly. "More than you realize. You see, Walter, the best leaders are the ones who understand the struggle firsthand. You've lived it. You know what it means to fight for every scrap of dignity. And that perspective is exactly what we need." The room fell silent for a moment as Walter absorbed the weight of Henry's words. James watched, his own mind racing with questions. Who was this man, really? And why was he so convinced that Walter was the key to something larger? As the silence stretched, Henry leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Take the night to think it over," he said. "But know this, opportunities like this don't come around often, and when they do, they have the power to change not just one life, but many." James glanced at Walter, who looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Whatever was happening here, it was far from over. Walter couldn't sleep that night. He sat by the small window of the shelter he'd been calling home, the card still in his hand, now joined by the memories of Henry Wilson's words. Lead the program. It felt absurd, like a mix-up in someone's grand plan. All his life, Walter had been fixing engines, not leading anything beyond his own two hands. And yet, there was a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, hope. That tiny spark was enough to keep him awake, his mind wrestling with the possibilities and the doubts. James, meanwhile, lay on his worn-out couch, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the image of Henry Wilson's office, the confidence in his voice, and the sheer faith he had placed in Walter. It was baffling. How could a man so down on his luck become the centerpiece of something so significant? And why did James feel like he was now part of it, whether he wanted to be or not? His phone buzzed, but he ignored it. The job search could wait another day. Right now, something bigger was pulling at his focus. The next morning, James showed up at Walter's curb just as the older man stepped outside, his face a mask of nervous determination. Without a word, James fell into step beside him, a silent agreement between the two. Walter didn't protest. He was grateful for the company, even if he couldn't find the words to say so. They walked together to the same building, and when they reached the unmarked door, Walter hesitated again. "You ready?" James asked, his tone light but his expression serious. Walter took a deep breath, then nodded. "Guess there's only one way to find out." Inside, the atmosphere was the same as the day before, but this time the receptionist greeted them with a knowing smile. "Mr. Wilson is waiting for you," she said, motioning toward the hall. Walter's steps felt heavier as they approached the office, and when the door opened, Henry was already standing, his presence commanding yet oddly comforting. "Good morning, Walter." "James," he said, nodding to both. "I'm glad you came back." Walter sat, his hands clasped tightly together. James leaned against the wall, sensing that this was Walter's moment, but unable to completely stay in the background. Henry began explaining in detail what the Foundation was doing, how it aimed to give people like Walter not just jobs, but a voice. He spoke about the need for real stories, for authentic leadership that could inspire others. As Henry spoke, something shifted in Walter. He listened intently, his doubts slowly giving way to curiosity, then resolve. But just as he was beginning to find his footing, Henry's phone buzzed sharply on the desk. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening for the first time. "Excuse me," he said, standing and stepping outside. The room fell silent. Walter and James exchanged a look, the air thick with unspoken questions. A few minutes later, Henry returned, his expression unreadable. "We may have a problem," he said, sitting down. "It seems the program has attracted some attention, some of it unwanted. There's a group looking to discredit what we're doing here. They think it's a waste of resources to invest in people who've failed by society's standards." James felt his chest tighten. "What kind of attention?" he asked, unable to stop himself. Henry sighed. "Enough that it could derail everything. They're already pushing stories to the press, spinning this as a misguided charity project instead of what it really is. Walter, this could be your first test as a leader, proving to people why this matters." Walter blinked, stunned. "But I'm not. I don't even know where to start." "That's exactly why you're the right person," Henry said firmly. "Because you're not coming at this with spin or strategy. You're coming at this with truth." The weight of those words settled over Walter. He looked at James, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. For the first time in years, Walter felt the embers of a fire reigniting inside him. But the stakes were higher than he had imagined, and the path ahead was filled with obstacles he wasn't sure he could overcome. The tension in the room was palpable as the reality of the challenge set in. Whatever came next, it was clear that Walter's journey was far from over, and that the fight to prove himself and the program's worth had only just begun. Walter sat in the quiet of the room, his thoughts racing as Henry's words echoed in his mind. He had been thrust into a situation he couldn't have imagined just days ago, and now the weight of expectations bore down on him. James could see the tension etched on Walter's face and spoke up, trying to break the silence. "What's the next step, Henry? How do we stop this from unraveling?" Henry leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp and calculating. "The best way to counter their narrative is with your story, Walter. People need to see the truth. The world doesn't need another corporate press release. It needs authenticity. If you're willing, we'll set up an interview with one of the media outlets. You'll share your journey, your struggles, and why programs like this matter. It's risky, but it could turn everything around." Walter hesitated, his mind flashing to the years he had spent on the streets, invisible and forgotten. The idea of putting himself in the spotlight made his stomach churn. But he also understood the stakes. If he didn't speak up, others like him might never get the second chance they deserved. "I'll do it," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Henry nodded, satisfied, and began outlining the plan. But as he spoke, his assistant stepped into the room, her expression unusually grim. She handed him a folder, her voice low. "You need to see this. It just came in." Henry opened the folder, his face hardening as he scanned the contents. He set it down, his jaw tightening. "It seems the opposition has taken things a step further. They've dug into your past, Walter." Walter stiffened, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" "They're trying to discredit you personally," Henry explained. "They found records of an incident from years ago, something about an argument with a former employer. They're spinning it as evidence that you're unreliable and unfit to represent this program." Walter's shoulders slumped. He knew exactly what Henry was talking about. Years ago, when he'd been working at a small auto repair shop, a dispute over wages had escalated into a heated confrontation. Walter had walked away from the job, but the bitterness of that moment had lingered. "It wasn't like they're going to make it sound," Walter said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was standing up for what was fair." "We know that," Henry said firmly, "but they're counting on the public not looking any deeper. This is how they play. They sow doubt and let the headlines do the rest." James stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes. "This is ridiculous. They're going after a man who's just trying to make a difference. There's got to be a way to fight back." "There is," Henry replied, his gaze locked on Walter. "The truth. But it's going to take courage, Walter. You'll need to face this head-on." Walter sat quietly, the enormity of the situation sinking in. He had thought fixing engines was the hardest work he'd ever done, but this was an entirely different kind of challenge. The stakes weren't just his reputation. They were the hopes of everyone this program could help. The tension in the room was thick as they began to discuss the next steps. But just as they were formulating a plan, Henry's phone buzzed again. This time, his expression shifted from concern to outright shock as he read the message. "We have another problem," he said, his voice low. James leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What now?" Henry looked up, his eyes filled with urgency. "Someone inside the Foundation is leaking information. They've been feeding the opposition details about our plans, and now it's not just about Walter. They're targeting the entire program." The room fell silent. Walter's hands gripped the armrests of his chair as the gravity of the situation grew heavier. Not only was his story under attack, but now there was betrayal from within. James could feel the frustration boiling inside him. "Who would do something like that?" he asked, his voice edged with disbelief. "We don't know yet," Henry admitted. "But if we don't figure it out soon, everything we've built could fall apart before we even have a chance to defend it." Walter's heart pounded in his chest. The idea of someone sabotaging something so critical left him both angry and deeply unsettled. For the first time, he wondered if he was truly prepared for what lay ahead. But even as doubt crept in, a small voice inside him reminded him of everything he had endured to get here. This wasn't just a fight for himself. It was for everyone who needed hope, everyone who needed a chance to prove they weren't defined by their worst days. Henry's voice broke through the tension. "We'll find out who's behind this, and we'll stop them. But Walter, you need to decide. Are you ready to fight for this, even when it gets harder? Walter looked up, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. I've been fighting my whole life, he said. What's one more battle? Walter sat in the small, brightly lit studio, a microphone clipped to his worn but neatly pressed shirt. The interviewer across from him adjusted her notes, her gaze sharp yet encouraging. The cameras were rolling, and the world was about to hear his story. Walter took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly, but he didn't let it show. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsing the truth in his head over and over. This was his chance to set the record straight, not just for himself but for the program and the countless lives it could change. He started slowly, recounting his days as a mechanic, his years in the military, and the tragic spiral that had left him homeless. His voice cracked when he spoke of losing everything after his wife's illness, but he pressed on. He spoke with honesty, without embellishment, and as he did, something remarkable began to happen. The interviewer, initially composed and professional, leaned forward, visibly moved. Walter's words weren't just a defense, they were a call to action, a reminder of the humanity often lost in society's rush to judge and dismiss. But just as Walter was finding his rhythm, the unexpected twist arrived. The doors to the studio burst open, and a man in a sharp suit strode in, his face familiar. It was the driver of the car Walter had fixed, the one who had handed him the card that started everything. The commotion caused the crew to pause, and the interviewer looked up, startled. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the man said, his voice steady but loud enough to command attention. "But there's something that needs to be said." Walter froze, unsure of what was happening. The man turned to the cameras, his presence both intimidating and captivating. "My name is David Harris, and I was the one who first met Walter on the street that day. What I didn't mention at the time was that I've been working alongside Henry Wilson for years to find people exactly like Walter, people who remind us that integrity and resilience can't be manufactured." The room was silent, everyone hanging on his words. When I called Henry after Walter helped me, I didn't just tell him about a kind stranger. I told him we'd found someone who could truly represent what this program stands for. But even I underestimated the lengths some people would go to in trying to stop us. David pulled out a stack of papers from his briefcase and laid them on the interviewer's desk. "These are records proving that the so-called leaks and attacks on Walter's character were orchestrated by a former board member we ousted for misusing funds. They've been trying to sabotage us from the inside, but I'm here to make sure the truth comes out." The cameras captured every word, and the tension in the room shifted. Walter stared at David, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. The interviewer quickly regained her composure, addressing both men. "This changes everything," she said. "Walter, how do you feel knowing this has been part of a larger effort to discredit you?" Walter took a moment to collect his thoughts. "I think it just shows how much work there is left to do," he said quietly but firmly. "If this program can help even one person get back on their feet, it's worth fighting for. And if my story helps people see that, then maybe all of this happened for a reason." The interview wrapped up shortly after, but the real impact was just beginning. Within hours, clips of Walter's words and David's revelations spread across social media, sparking a wave of public support. The opposition's narrative crumbled under the weight of the truth, and donations to the program surged. But the final twist came the next morning, when Walter walked into Henry's office to thank him for standing by his side. As he stepped in, Henry handed him a letter, his expression warm but serious. "This just came in," he said. "It's from the governor's office." Walter opened the letter, his eyes scanning the neatly printed words. He couldn't believe what he was reading. The program had not only gained statewide recognition, but was being considered as a model for a national initiative to support veterans and displaced workers. Walter's story had become more than just his own. It was now the foundation for something far bigger. As he left the office, the weight he had carried for so long felt lighter. He looked out at the city, the streets that had once seemed so unforgiving, and felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Walter believed he was exactly where he was meant to be. Walter stood outside Henry's office, clutching the letter that promised a future far beyond anything he could have imagined. The crisp morning air felt different now, carrying a sense of possibility rather than dread. The streets, once a maze of struggles, seemed to hum with a quiet acknowledgment of his journey. For the first time in years, Walter felt not just visible but valued. He took a deep breath, the weight of his past finally beginning to lift. James was waiting near the curb, his hands in his pockets, his usual restless energy subdued. When Walter approached, James grinned, though there was a hint of something deeper in his eyes. "So," he said, "how does it feel to be the face of a national program?" Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "Overwhelming," he admitted. "But in a good way. For the first time, it feels like all the wrong turns might have led somewhere right." James nodded, the admiration clear on his face. "You deserve it. And hey, maybe now you can teach me how to fix a car without blowing something up." Walter laughed, the sound genuine and free. It was a moment of lightness he hadn't known in years. "Any time, kid," he said. "But don't think you're off the hook. I'm going to need some help keeping all this straight." The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and plans. Walter found himself at the center of a movement, his story inspiring others to come forward with their own experiences of resilience and hope. Veterans reached out, mechanics shared their struggles, and people who had once felt invisible began to find their voices. Walter didn't see himself as a hero, but he understood the power of his story now. It wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been counted out but refused to give up. James, too, found new purpose. Inspired by Walter's journey, he took on a role within the foundation, helping to connect with people who needed a second chance. It wasn't the path he had planned, but it was one that felt right. For the first time in years, James felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Months later, as the program's success grew, Walter found himself back on the streets where it all began. This time, he wasn't alone. A group of volunteers, including James and several others from the foundation, handed out warm meals and supplies to those still struggling. Walter's presence brought a sense of hope to the people he met, his story proof that change was possible. As the sun set that evening, Walter stood near the spot where he had once sat with his cardboard sign. He looked out at the city, his heart full of gratitude. He thought of his late wife, Martha, and the words she used to say when times were tough. "Kindness always finds its way back to you." For Walter, those words had never felt more true. His life had come full circle, but it was no longer defined by loss or despair. It was a testament to the power of second chances and the simple but profound truth that every person, no matter how broken they may feel, has something valuable to offer the world. Walter turned to James, a small smile on his face. "Let's keep going," he said. "There's still more to do." And with that, Walter stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next, knowing he wasn't alone anymore. The past was behind him, but the lessons it carried had shaped a future filled with purpose and hope. Walter's story wasn't just about one man's journey. It was about the strength of the human spirit and the enduring power of compassion. It was proof that it's never too late to start again.